Before it was a prison, it was a fortress. Before it was a fortress, it was nothing. Just a bare rock sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay with no water, no dock, and currents cold enough to kill. Nobody looked at that rock and thought, prison. But 80 years later, the United States government stood in front of it and declared it the most inescapable facility ever built on American soil. And the strangest part? Nobody planned for it to become that, not even close. I used AI to show you how Alcatraz was built, so let's dive in. The military fortress, 1850s to 1910s. The story of Alcatraz as a fortress begins with gold. In January 1848, gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Within 3 years, San Francisco's population had gone from roughly 500 people to more than 35,000. Ships from Europe, South America, and Asia crowded the bay. The city was growing faster than anyone could track. And suddenly, the entrance to San Francisco Bay was one of the most valuable stretches of water in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. Army looked at that bay, looked at the small, rocky island sitting right at its mouth, and drew an obvious conclusion. In November 1850, a presidential order designated Alcatraz Island as a United States military reservation. Whoever controlled that rock controlled access to San Francisco. The Army intended to control it, so they sent an engineer to figure it out. Construction began in 1853 under the direction of Lieutenant Zealous B. Tower of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Tower arrived with a crew and a list of problems he had not fully anticipated. The island had no usable infrastructure at all. Every tool, every bag of cement, every length of timber had to arrive by boat. The sandstone bedrock had to be blasted and carved to create level ground. And because local stone was not of sufficient quality, much of the granite used in the fortifications had to be imported from China. Labor was the other problem. California in the 1850s was not short of workers in theory. In practice, anyone capable of doing the work had headed to the hills to look for gold. The men who showed up to build Fort Alcatraz were doing it because they had no better option, and the conditions on the island made it some of the least desirable construction work in the state. Despite all of that, the fort took shape. Workers cut into the sandstone, laid brick and stone walls that followed the natural contours of the island's cliffs and built upward from the rock itself. Unlike most American military fortifications of the era, which involved heavy earthworks and engineered berms, Alcatraz's design worked with the rock rather than against it. The island's steep cliffs became part of the defense. Walls rose straight out of the rock face. The island's geography was doing most of the work. At the summit of the island, workers raised the citadel, a 3-story brick barracks that served as the fort's last line of defense against ground attack. It could house 200 soldiers and store enough food for a 4-month siege. Surrounding it and covering the bay approaches were gun batteries designed to hold more than 100 cannons, making Alcatraz the most heavily armed military position on the entire west coast of the United States. By 1854, the island's first lighthouse was operational, the first functioning lighthouse on the west coast. Fort Alcatraz was officially garrisoned on December 30th, 1859, when Captain Joseph Stewart arrived with 86 men of Company H, 3rd U.S. Artillery. The final construction cost was $87,698. For that amount, the Army had turned a barren rock into the most fortified point between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. The island never fired its guns in combat, not once, but the prison function that was supposed to be a footnote began almost immediately. As early as 1859, soldiers convicted of crimes were confined in the guardhouse basement. The reasoning was entirely practical. The bay's cold water and punishing currents made escape almost impossible without even trying, and other garrisons quickly noticed. They started sending their own problem prisoners to the island. When the Civil War broke out in April 1861, the island's population surged. Alcatraz was designated the military prison for the entire Department of the Pacific, covering most of the territory west of the Rocky Mountains. Confederate sympathizers, civilians held for treason, soldiers convicted of desertion or assault, all of them came to the island. At the peak of the war, 433 military personnel were stationed there, and Alcatraz had 111 cannons encircling it. It was the most powerful fort west of the Mississippi. After the war, the defensive mission faded. The prison mission did not. The number of cells was expanded in 1867, and the facility became an official long-term military prison in 1868. In the 1870s, inmates were put to work reshaping the island itself, dumping debris into the bay's coves and leveling the terrain under the direction of Major George Mendel. The prisoners were physically building the ground beneath their own feet. Nobody recorded what they thought about that. Whether the irony registered or not, the work continued. The island they were reshaping would hold them for years after the last shovel was set down. The Spanish-American War in 1898 pushed the population from around 26 inmates to more than 450 almost overnight. The aging citadel and its original wooden cells buckled under the pressure. Fires in the wooden cell blocks became a recurring threat. By 1907, the Army formally ended the island's defensive role and designated Alcatraz as a full-time military prison. The era of the fortress was over. The era of the prison was about to get a great deal more serious. The island had outgrown every purpose it had been built for. Now it needed a new one. The transition phase, 1910 to 1933. By the time the Army got around to rebuilding Alcatraz properly, the original citadel was in genuinely dangerous condition. 5 decades of salt air had eaten through the brick. The wooden prison structures were a fire hazard. The island was holding hundreds of prisoners in facilities that had been improvised, expanded, and patched across 40 years without any serious structural overhaul. In 1908, the upper levels of the citadel were demolished. The 3-story brick barracks that had been the heart of Fort Alcatraz since 1859 came down to its lowest level, which sat below ground in an excavated pit originally designed to create a defensive dry moat. That basement was not demolished. It was going to become the foundation of something else entirely. In 1909, construction began on a new cell house designed by Major Reuben Turner, a military construction engineer. The project had an unusual labor force. The inmates built it themselves. Over 3 years, prisoners poured concrete, laid foundations, erected walls, and raised a 3-story structure on top of the demolished citadel's base. The old basement was incorporated directly into the new building as a sublevel, a dark underground space that would eventually become the source of Alcatraz's most persistent legend about dungeons beneath the prison floor. There were no dungeons in the Gothic sense, but there was a sealed subterranean level, and the stories it generated were never fully corrected. When the new cell house was completed in 1912, it was the longest reinforced concrete building in the world. 500 feet of poured concrete sitting on a 22-acre island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The construction budget was $250,000, 3 times what the entire original fort had cost. Materials from the old citadel were recycled throughout. Iron staircases were retained. Granite gun mounts were broken up and used as retaining walls along the wharf. The facility was renamed the Pacific Branch, U.S. Military Prison. In 1915, it was renamed again as the United States Disciplinary Barracks. The new name reflected a shift in philosophy. The Army was no longer thinking of Alcatraz purely as a punishment facility. The official framing was rehabilitation. Prisoners attended military training, received remedial education, and were assigned vocational work. During World War I, the population expanded to include conscientious objectors and German prisoners of war. But none of that changed the physical reality of what the island was. You could rename it, reframe its mission, and add a classroom to the schedule. And the bay was still the bay. The currents were still cold enough to kill, and the building the inmates had constructed was already built like a prison rather than a barracks. Through the 1920s, the population hovered between 200 and 300 men. The facility ran more or less as intended. By the early 1930s, the Army had a new problem. The rise of organized crime in the United States had created a class of criminal that existing federal institutions were not equipped to contain. Prohibition had funded a generation of gangsters with money, lawyers, and connections that reached inside prison walls. Al Capone ran his Chicago operation from a prison cell in Atlanta. The system was visibly failing. The Army had no particular use for Alcatraz anymore. The federal government needed exactly what the island was: isolated, forbidding, and already built. On October 12, 1933, the United States Department of Justice formally acquired the island from the War Department. 32 of the remaining military prisoners stayed behind as the paperwork was processed. The federal government was now in possession of the longest concrete prison building in the world, sitting 2 kilometers offshore in San Francisco Bay. All it had to do was make it inescapable. Federal prison construction, 1933 to 1934. The conversion work that followed was not cosmetic. The Army's disciplinary barracks had been a minimum security facility by the standards of what the federal government was now planning. Most prisoners during the military era were locked in cells only at night. The new institution needed to contain men who had already escaped from, bribed their way out of, or made a mockery of every other federal prison in the country. Almost everything about the building's security had to be rebuilt from scratch. The cells came first. The Army's existing bars were replaced with a new generation of hardened toolproof steel, specifically engineered to resist cutting and tampering. Standard prison steel of the era could be worked through with a hacksaw given enough time and the right blade, so the new bars at Alcatraz were hardened against exactly that method. Each cell measured 1.5 meters wide by 2.7 meters deep, fitted with a cot, a shelf, a toilet, and a small sink with cold running water. Sparse and deliberate. The cell was not supposed to be comfortable, and nothing in its design suggested otherwise. The cell door mechanism was replaced entirely. The Army's individual key locks were pulled out, and a fully mechanical remote control system was installed in their place. The new system could open or close individual cells or entire tiers simultaneously, operated by armed officers from secured positions at the end of each cell block. No electricity was involved anywhere in the mechanism. It ran on levers, gears, and interlocking linkages, which made it far harder to sabotage than an electrical system, and it put guards in control of every door on a tier without ever stepping onto the prison floor. At both ends of the main cell blocks, elevated barred walkways were constructed. The gun galleries. Armed officers patrolled these walkways above the cell corridors from positions that no inmate could reach. The galleries were accessible only from outside the cell room, which meant that gaining control of the prison floor gave a prisoner no path to the armed positions above him. The guards and the prisoners occupied the same building, but 2 physically separate systems within it. Electromagnetic metal detectors were installed at the key choke points throughout the facility, among the first in any American prison. Every inmate passing from one area to another passed through one. The dining hall, which prison administrators considered the most dangerous space in any penitentiary because it concentrated the entire population in one room, was fitted with remote-controlled tear gas canisters mounted in the ceiling. If a riot started, officers could flood the hall with gas from a secured position without entering it. Outside the cell house, the recreation yard was enclosed by walls nearly 6 meters high, topped with additional fencing and barbed wire. Guard towers equipped with searchlights and high-powered rifles surrounded the complex. A catwalk ran the outer perimeter and was staffed whenever prisoners were allowed outside. The island's water supply, none of which existed naturally on the rock, was handled through regular barge deliveries from the mainland and stored in a water tower at the island's summit. The isolation design was built into the original cell house from the beginning. D Block had been part of the 1912 structure all along, 42 cells physically separated from the main population behind a concrete wall. But during the 1933-34 federal conversion, its purpose was fundamentally transformed. 6 of its lower cells were fitted with solid steel doors that blocked all light and sound entirely. Inmates assigned to those 6 cells could be confined there for up to 24 hours a day, with no human contact no natural light, and no exposure to any outside stimulus whatsoever. It was called the hole. The cells themselves were not new. What was new was the intention behind them, and the men who would eventually be placed inside. Men who went in came out different. Every account from the federal era says the same thing. The hole worked. The first warden appointed to run the new penitentiary was James A. Johnston. He had previously run California's Folsom and San Quentin prisons and had a reputation for being completely unsentimental about the purpose of the facility under his command. Johnston established a strict regimen from day one. Inmates had 4 rights: food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Everything else was a privilege that had to be earned and could be revoked. He hired 1 correctional officer for every 3 prisoners, a ratio far more intensive than any other federal prison in the country at the time. The facility officially opened on July 1st, 1934. Then, on August 11th, the first shipment of inmates arrived. 137 prisoners transferred by train from the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, escorted by 60 FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and railway security officials. They arrived handcuffed in high-security coaches, were ferried across the bay, and walked through the doors of the building that Army prisoners had constructed with their own hands 22 years earlier. Among the early arrivals was Al Capone, who had been running his Chicago operation from a cell in Atlanta and expected to continue doing so. Johnston made clear on the first day that Alcatraz did not work that way. No special treatment, no outside communication beyond what the rules permitted, no continuation of outside business. Capone spent his first weeks doing laundry. The most powerful gangster in America, folding sheets on an island 2 kilometers from the mainland with nowhere to go. The island now held the inmates other federal prisons had run out of ways to manage, in a building designed specifically to keep them there. The water surrounding the island was still cold. The currents were still punishing, and the mainland was still 2 kilometers away. None of that had changed. But now those facts were backed by tool-proof steel, mechanical cell locks, gun galleries, tear gas, metal detectors, and a warden who meant every word of the rules he had written. America's most secure prison was not just open, it was built to stay that way. 14 escape attempts, 36 men. Only 3 never confirmed caught or dead. The building Army prisoners constructed with their own hands held for 29 straight years. If this got your attention, hit subscribe and give this video a like. And let me know in the comments, what story or place do you want me to dive into next?